Okay, thank you so much for everyone joining us here today. My name is Xander McDonald. I'm the Director of Marketing here at Opportunity International, and I want to welcome you to our webinar, Lunch from the Field, looking at opportunities response to global education. I'd like to welcome Dan Murray, our President and CEO, and Dan will get us started. Dan.
Well, thank you, Andrew, and thank you, everyone, for taking some time out. Good morning to those on the West Coast. Good afternoon to those in the rest of the country. I appreciate you just taking a bit of time out of your busy day to learn more about the work of Opportunity International, particularly as it applies to education. As you know, Opportunity International is a microfinance charity bringing financial inclusion and training to create pathways out of poverty. When it's applied to the area of education, you kind of get a double benefit, because the proprietors and surrounding community members and teachers at the schools acquire sustainable livelihoods, but then you're also providing quality education to kids, which of course becomes a pathway out of poverty for them as well. And Opportunity International's education finance initiative has had tremendous impact, as you're about to hear from my wonderful colleague, Andrew McCusker. And Andrew is our special guest, and it's absolutely my delight to welcome him to this webinar and to introduce him before he opens up. Andrew is the head of education finance at Opportunity International. And prior to joining Opportunity, Andrew served in the corporate finance team for Bridge International Academies, working with over 500 low-cost schools across Africa and Asia. Splitting time between London and Nairobi, Kenya, he worked with both investors and education providers, helping to conduct financial impact analyses of key business decisions for these schools and lift education standards. He began his career at Goldman Sachs, serving as executive director of global investment research, where he managed relationships with investors and built an international team working in a number of low-cost markets. Andrew brings a diverse skill set to the education finance team, including fundraising, finance, education, operations analysis, capacity building, performance reporting, and team management. Originally from Australia, he holds a bachelor's degree in commerce from the University of Melbourne and is a chartered financial analyst. He currently lives in London. And it's just my honor to welcome my esteemed colleague, Andrew, to lead us forward. He's going to present, and then when he's finished his presentation, we will take questions. So please, save up your questions or use the Q&A tab and start sending them in, and we'll make sure that we respond to as many of them as we can. Andrew, over to you.
Thanks very much, Dan, and thanks, Andrew, for the introduction as well. Hi, everyone, and thank you very much for joining on this webinar. Particularly big thanks to everyone on the West Coast. I was just talking to Dan before the call, and we were saying it's getting more like dinner time and even red wine time here in London in the UK. And so thank you for everyone taking an early lunch on the West Coast. What I thought I could do today is provide a quick overview of the education finance program at Opportunity International for anyone who may be new to the program. Talk a little bit about what we're seeing as a result of COVID on the schools and the communities with which we work. Spend a little bit of time talking about how we as a program have responded to it, and then close on what our plans are for the next 3 years, given what we know about the current education deficit and what has happened through COVID. I realize that there may be questions that come up. What I'll plan to do is perhaps present for about 20 or 25 minutes, and then leave plenty of time to answer any questions that you may have towards the back end of the call. And so with that, I'll start sharing my screen now. Perfect. And so for those new to the education finance program or the global education deficit, the reason that we exist is to get more kids into better schools. Before I joined the global education sector, this statistic really surprised me. There's about 6 out of 10 school-age kids that prior to COVID were not learning. And so most of these kids don't sit in North America or the UK, where I'm calling from today, or Australia, where I grew up. Most kids are sitting in Sub-Saharan Africa or South Asia, and they fall into 2 buckets. There's about 260 million kids around the world that don't go to school. And so they may be kids that have never set foot into a classroom, or that have entered the classroom at some stage, but have fallen, but have dropped out. In addition to that, there's another 350 million kids that are sitting in a classroom but are not learning much when they're there. The goal of the Education Finance program is to address both of those sets of kids. I just might fix the slides just before I move on. In terms of the Education Finance model, we're looking to increase access to education and improve the quality. On the access side, the way that we do this is that we work with local financial institutions in the countries that have either a lot of kids out of school or in school and not learning. And we work with those financial institutions to accelerate their investments into the school sector. And so what we mean by that is we create loan products for schools to invest in new classrooms, into washrooms, into dormitories, and to purchase assets like school buses, and increase and provide loans to parents and guardians to pay for school fees to increase the demand for schooling. Once one of our banking partners has lent to a portfolio of schools, then we bring in what is called the Education Quality Program, which is effectively designed to improve learning outcomes for kids that are sitting in school and to help school leaders to run their schools as more sustainable enterprises that grow over time and ultimately educate more kids. In terms of the model, what we found over the journey since the program was launched in 2008 is that when we provide schools with access to funding so that they can invest into their schools and professional development, there's 4 things that happen. The first thing we know is that the schools would grow faster than they otherwise would. And this happens because the schools invest into their facilities to increase the number of classroom seats. Secondly, we know that students do better at schools, in that what we found in partnership with the University of Chicago and an author called Stephen Levitt, that you may be familiar with from his work of Freakonomics, is that schools that have access to capital for the first time, so they can borrow money to invest into their schools, not only increases the size of the school, but it also improves learning outcomes for the kids in those schools by about 7 percentage points. Thirdly, we know that schools that participate in the Education Quality Program improve in school quality. And what we mean by that is they improve in some of the different domains of school quality, such as child protection, their environment and physical setting, their teacher recruitment and training. In that more than half of the schools that are in that program after 2 years do show improvements in one or more of those areas. And lastly, we know that permanent jobs are created. So for every loan that is provided to a school, about 3 teaching jobs are created, in addition to 5 permanent jobs in the community. Effectively, what we're trying to do in the Education Finance program is change schools that look like this into schools that look a little bit like this. These are both photos that I've taken over the last 5 years, and I'll talk a little bit about those 2 photos as we move through the presentation. In terms of the journey of Education Finance, it's been a little bit of a ride, and particularly over the last few years, as you can see on the chart here. Effectively, what we're seeing in the markets in which we operate is that there's a large number of kids out of school. High fertility rates are driving increases in demand for education, which is driven by effectively an increase in the school-age population. And increasingly, parents are choosing to send their kids to better schools. And so what that means for us is we have a very big market with which we can operate in. And we effectively, the growth or the impact of this program is not determined by the market. Since 2012, the program's reached about 7.5 million kids through its lending activities. in that there's about 27,000 schools around the world that have had investment into them from our financial institution partners over the time that we've been working with them. And I think it's fair to say that that impact that we've had in terms of providing access and quality of education to those 27,000 schools has played a bit of a role in the reduction in the number of children out of school that we've seen as an industry over the last 20 years. So you can see here in this chart that in the year 2000, there was roughly about 380 million kids that were out of school. Today, we know that number's around 258 million, or prior to COVID at least. But clearly the job is not done. So 250 million kids out of the classroom, in addition to these 350 million kids that you can see here in this photo that are in the classroom, but the likelihood of them achieving good learning outcomes is pretty low. This is a photo that I took in central Malawi in a town called Kandy in 2015. And it's a photo of a public school in a pretty remote town. This public school had 1,200 kids, and you can see here a picture of one of the classrooms. In this classroom, there was 150 kids with one teacher. Not a whole lot of learning materials around, certainly no desks. And as education outcomes and the statistics would tell us about public schooling and outcomes in Malawi, pretty little probability of achieving any meaningful learning gains. One of the biggest challenges over the last 12 months for us as an industry, as well as many other industries that you all probably work and are associated with, is the impact that COVID has had on it. COVID has particularly hit the education sector, as I guess many of you will be aware, those that have children, grandkids, other family members attending schools, with school closures throughout most of the world last year, including Canada. At the peak in late March of last year, there was about 1.5 billion kids that all of a sudden were removed from the classroom. And while we've seen some pretty strong progress through the fourth quarter of last calendar year and in the first 3 or 4 months of this year, in terms of schools beginning to reopen and get students back into the classroom, there's still another 170 odd million that are out of the classroom as a result of COVID-related restrictions. I think one of the things that we're most worried about as a program is the risk that we lose some of these kids to the classroom permanently. In that what we've seen in previous school closures, for example, in West Africa with the outbreak of Ebola, is that we lost a number of kids to the classroom permanently as a result of prolonged school outages. And that was due to reasons like they got jobs, they generated other income, they moved into marriage or pregnancy a little bit earlier than they otherwise may have. In terms of the impact of the beneficiaries of our program, there's effectively 4 buckets, and they've been impacted in different ways, albeit all in very severe ways as a result of these COVID-related school closures. Starting with students, my guess is that students in Canada have had a pretty hard time improving learning outcomes at the same rate over the last 12 months as they may have had in the previous 12 months or with previous cohorts of students in their positions. I would say that the impact of students in the markets in which we operate is probably a lot worse. In that some of the luxuries that we have here in the UK, or that a student here would have in the UK, such as the availability of a digital device, the availability of content, the large access to data, and large digital literacy, means that there is some chance that a student here can continue to achieve learning gains even when they're outside of the classroom. In a lot of the markets that we work in, that's just not the case, in that access to devices may be low because either the device doesn't exist in the family or household, or it's shared between a number of users in that household. remembering that in most of the markets that we work in, particularly across sub-Saharan Africa, on average, parents will have 5 or 6 kids. Secondly, on teachers. Throughout the course of last year, we continued to see deteriorations in the financial positions of schools. In May of last year, we learned that 80% of the schools in our program had just 1 month of cash remaining, and they had to make hard decisions on what they would do in terms of paying their teachers and keeping them on payroll. I'll speak a little bit about our program response to this, but it was certainly a pretty hard time to be a teacher in a low-income market through the course of last year and even into this year. Thirdly, it was tough on school proprietors. And so particularly for school proprietors that had done a good job of growing their business, increasing enrollments, generating more revenue and educating more kids, to all of a sudden see that unwind made last year a pretty tough year for many of the 14,000 school proprietors that we work with right now. And lastly, on education investors or the financial institutions that we work with, their lending businesses were impacted not just in the education sector, but in a number of the other and a number of the other sectors in which they had exposure, which made collecting repayments pretty tough, and therefore the financial stability and performance of the financial institutions did suffer. I'm happy to answer any questions on COVID and the impact of that later on in the call if you are interested. So in terms of like how the program responded, I was particularly pleased and proud of our team's efforts last year in a pretty challenging personal circumstances for all of us, in particularly our field-based staff. I think one of the great things to come out of COVID for us and our program is the development of this tool called Pathways to Reopening. It's effectively a guide that our education quality team are using with school leaders as we speak to prepare schools and help schools to reopen safely, realizing that there's new regulations around social distancing, health and hygiene that didn't exist prior to COVID, on retaining their staff and attracting them back into the classroom as soon as they can, and on recruiting pupils at the end of COVID, realizing that the real risk of having students never return to the classroom is pretty real, as we saw in West Africa with Ebola. In terms of one of the schools that we work with, this is actually the last school that I visited prior to the start of COVID in January of last year. This school is in Kumasi in northern Ghana. The school here, as you can see, is pretty different from the school in central Malawi that I showed earlier on, in that this school here charges $8 a month or $8 US, so about 10 Canadian dollars a month for a child to attend. It has smaller class sizes, it has learning materials, and it has classroom furniture. In addition to this, the teacher and the school proprietor at this school also participate in our education quality program, so they get professional development. I was speaking to our education specialist on our team who manages the relationship with the school and administers the training just last week. This school had a pretty tough time through the course of last year in that it was effectively closed from March up until January of this year. Through that time, it was able to collect very little revenue. The school teachers and leaders managed to develop communication channels with their parents of the school through WhatsApp and use that as a way or a channel to distribute learning to encourage some sort of home-based schooling while the school was closed. The school fully reopened in middle of January of this year and has had about 75% of its students return to the classroom, which is obviously really great news for them, for the teachers, for the financial institution. One of the challenges that they still have today is that they're unable to operate their school bus service, and therefore they are, there's kids that are outside of the catchment area of effectively walking or other means of transport to get to school who have been unable to return to this school as a result of COVID. And the issue there is around the ability of the school to provide the school bus service and practice social distancing. Moving on to the goals of the program, particularly following what's happened with COVID, the good news is that not a whole lot has changed, in that we're still continuing to see large amounts of demand for growing these types of schools from both the schools and the financial institutions with which we work. And as a result of that, we're still very confident that we can take these education lending products to more and more financial institutions around the world. And so the first goal over the next 3 years is for us to take these education lending products to invest in more schools to over 100 financial institutions around the world. To put that number in perspective, about 3 years ago, we were working with 16 financial institutions. And today we're working with about 69 financial institutions around the world. Our second objective is to improve learning outcomes in the schools. And so what we mean by that is that kids that are enrolled in the schools and are attending the schools with which we work are improving in literacy, numeracy, and other methods of counting academic achievement. And the third goal is what we call establishing sector leadership. And what we mean by this is effectively sharing everything that we know about non-state schooling or low-cost schooling, the financing, operations, and quality of them, so that we can improve the body of knowledge and understanding of these types of schools and the most efficient way that we know to effectively invest in getting more kids into better schools. Now, we've had a pretty exciting, probably 4 or 5 months in education finance, particularly in the scheme of the history of the program, in that over the last few months, we've been successful in attracting some pretty significant funding and awards from the US government in particular. These are country-specific projects in Zambia, the Democratic Republic of Congo, and Tanzania, which effectively are allowing us to scale this program in a very significant way in these markets. And that's all been made possible through effectively the support of you all in this program over the last 12 or so years since its inception, which has allowed us to build what I certainly think is a very efficient way to get a large amount of kids into better schools. So the great news about these projects is that they're very large projects in specific countries that will allow us to do some very good systems-based work. In addition to that, we're hoping to attract private funding over the next few years of about 16 million Canadian dollars, which will allow us to effectively grow the program in our existing markets, as well as potentially enter into some new markets as well. The whole goal of this, be adding new financial institutions, adding new markets, and raising more funding for the program, is to effectively get another 6 million kids into better schools through this model. And with that, I'm very happy to pause for any questions or comments or ideas that anyone on the call may have, either about the global education deficit, the model, COVID, or the expansion plans for the future. Dan, I can see you've just popped up on the screen, so I don't know if you would like to moderate.
Well, I'll certainly help. I do have access to the Q&A here, and Andrew can jump in if needed as well. But there's already 3 questions that have appeared in our Q&A box. So why don't we start off with those? But let me just start off, Andrew, by thanking you for such a really informative presentation, really well thought out, but also just the impact that you and your team have established is a real credit to the work of your team. And Opportunity Canada, I'll just say to everyone, we're 100% committed to the Education Finance Initiative, and we're looking to continue to grow the support that Canada can bring to this and to see it continue to scale up. As you say, it's not limited by market opportunity, so pretty much as any resources we can throw at it, we can create more opportunities for kids. So this will continue to be a very strategic commitment by Canada to be a part of this journey forward. There's an anonymous question here that says, having developed the pathways to reopening for non-state schools, has there been any interest from the state sector in picking up this product, or have you found that this type of product has been developed in any state systems at all?
It's a great question. The answer to both of those questions is yes. And so the development of pathways to reopening was not just helpful for us in terms of trying to get more of the kids in the 2,200 schools in the education quality program back into the classroom as quickly as we could. But from a OI perspective or global branding perspective, it was also picked up by UNESCO and what called the Global Education Coalition. And through the publication and distribution of this product, UNESCO had asked us to join the Global Education Coalition, which has linked us with a bunch of other potential partners, well, both existing and potential partners, whether they be financing or operational partners, who are all trying to, at the moment, work towards getting kids back into school and having a continuation of learning. And so that's certainly been very helpful for us. But what it's also meant is that that product, Pathways to Reopening, has been distributed to all of those partners who have been using it in both private and public schooling. Now, most of the topics in Pathways to Reopening, for example, how to get kids back into the classroom, how to get teachers back into the classroom, and how to open safely, are all very relevant for both public and private schools.
I'm muted. That's great. There's a couple of questions here that are related, one from Chris and one from my colleague Ute, around just a better understanding of how it is that OI works with financial institutions, and how do the financial institutions get involved, and what, you know, how do we finance, what are we financing, or what are we leveraging? How does that work?
Yeah, that's a great question, Chris. Effectively, what we're trying to do with this program is maximize the leverage that we get on donor funding. And so the reason that I personally choose to work in this program is that we just, as an industry, don't have enough funding to get all of the 260 million kids into school and the 350 million kids that are in school and not learning, achieving learning outcomes. So there's just chronic underinvestment. Now, part of the reason for that is that in a lot of the markets that we work in, particularly across sub-Saharan Africa, the government share of spending on education is above global standards and above what we see in high and middle income countries. And so governments are trying, but there's two challenges that they have, which are both driven by high fertility rates. Because parents choose to have a large number of kids, we see a greater share of the population that is school aged, and therefore there is greater demand on state-based education. And secondly, as a result of that, you've got a larger share of the population that's not income producing and therefore paying tax. And so you're working with lower tax bases as a result. And so effectively what we're trying to do through our model is use a small amount of grant funding and multiply that into large amounts of investment into the non-state school sector by our local financial institution partners. And so when we're looking for partners, what we're effectively doing is looking for two characteristics. The first one of those is a willingness and ability to lend large amounts of capital to the non-state school sector. And secondly, it's in a willingness and ability to lend to schools that are working with communities that earn low incomes. And so effectively what we do is try to, or when we move into a new market, we will do a roadshow and go and meet and pitch the idea of education lending to as many of these financial institutions as we can. What we do with the financial institution is look to present the market opportunity to them, get them excited about the idea and the economics of education lending, and then work with them to design loan products that we think will work in these markets based on what we know work in other markets. Once they've developed the products, we work with them to build the capacity of their staff to sell the loans and to assess the credit risk of those loans. And so we find that is the most efficient way for us to increase investment into the non-state school sector.
Thanks, Andrew. I have a question from Don here, which I think probably I should address. It's what's the major focus besides education that International Opportunity is focused on for 2021? Don, great question. And of course, Education Finance is a we call a signature program. But we across the board with all 5 support member countries and our partners around the world continue. Probably one of our major and most important thrusts is microenterprise development. It's working with people at the bottom of the economic ladder to acquire sustainable livelihoods. And so that continues to be kind of, I would say, the main focus. And in fact, you could look at Education Finance as kind of a subcomponent of that, just particularly focused on schools as microenterprises. Just like we train an entrepreneur how to do a better job with, their hair salon or their grocery store, so that they can, be more effective. You do the same thing with schools to provide better outcomes in education. But we also have other signature programs. Agriculture finance is really about helping small landhold farmers to increase the yields on their small plots, but also to have better access to markets. And so there's a whole ecosystem that's emerging to make that happen. The same is applying to the health sector, particularly more about, health service workers who get into rural communities to have dramatic impact and at the same time acquire sustainable livelihood. There's a significant focus as well on digital financial services, and that's become even more important with the pandemic, as you can understand. And so there's a lot of investment right now in enabling our partners to deploy and exploit technology to provide better services to clients. And of course, we're still emerging with the pandemic, and so there's a significant focus on helping our partners and clients around the world to emerge from the pandemic and, as we call it, to thrive. A lot of clients, saw their livelihoods decimated, and so there's a lot of work being done client by client to provide, restructured loans, credit relief, training for, repivoting their businesses or whatever. So there's, I would say 2021 is going to see a fair amount of that kind of activity going forward as well. Andrew Wayne asked the question here, how do you monitor 24,000 schools to ensure performance is improving? This is an enormous task.
It is a really enormous task, and I think it's made more difficult, not just by COVID, but also by the different measures of education quality. And so what do we call a quality school, for example? Is it one that has good facilities? Is it one that has good institutional processes like child protection practices? Or is it a school that results in or drives improved learning outcomes for kids? And so what we do with the education quality program is that we have a team of education specialists who are based in the countries and markets with which we operate. Each of those education specialists works with a portfolio of schools, which averages about 60 schools at a time. And they work with those schools to provide professional development for the school leaders, as well as professional development for the teachers. And they do this through this product called Pathways to Excellence. This product allows the schools to self-assess their schools across 18 different areas of school quality. The data that we collect on those schools from that self-assessment is uploaded into the cloud, and we have access to that through dashboards on each individual school, if we like, or the aggregate of those schools. This allows us to track the performance of the schools over time. Now, the types of schools that we work with, I think that, as you may have seen in the photos, are pretty different from the school that I went to in Australia. And so quality is definitely an issue, not just in the public schools in the systems that we work with, but also in the schools that are recipients of either financing and or the education quality program that we provide. The whole goal of that program is to take a school from whatever level of quality it is right now to something better over time.
Great, thanks, Andrew. Chris asks a second question, and that's how does the school get income to pay the loans?
Great question, Chris. And so the schools that we work with generate some revenue. And so most typically that's through charging school fees to students. The school fees that are charged to students in the markets that we work with across Africa average about 10 Canadian dollars per student per month. And so the difference with the schools that we work with and the markets that we work is that private schools exist for poor people or people on low-income countries in the countries that we work, because there is just not enough coverage and or quality of public schooling. And the demand for education is outstripping the increase in supply. And so as a result of that, the schools in which we work with are growing, and new schools are being built or developed.
Super. There's a couple of questions that just want to know how active or where you're active in Latin America right now, and also plans for the future.
So the question was, where are we active in Latin America?
Yes, and also Latin American plans for the future.
Nice one, great question. It's a very relevant question, Dan, as you recognise from the conversation we had last week. And so our longest, almost established program in Latin America is in Colombia, where we run both the financing program and the education quality program. And we have plans to expand that program over the next few years, which some of you on the call will be well aware of. It's something that we're pretty excited about, particularly moving the financing into some of the more challenging areas or geographies within the country, particularly those where we're seeing an inflow of school-age kids coming from net migration from Venezuela. Our biggest market in Latin America is in Peru, and that is on the back of a very strong financial institution partner in that market that has done a really good job of growing their school lending portfolio with us over the last few years. In addition to that, we've recently started work in the Dominican Republic and Haiti on the financing side. However, haven't brought in the education quality program, but would really love to do that over the next few years if we're able to generate the funding to support that program.
Awesome. Well, we're certainly excited to, as I say, we want to support education finance wherever you're working, because you guys know how to deploy the resources and where, in sort of timeline fashion, where it makes the most sense to invest at any given time. But we do have a particular interest here in Canada, also in Latin America, so it'll be exciting to see how you expand there. There's a couple of questions by Don around the whole issue of fertility rates, family sizes, impact on quality of education. Is that addressed through the education piece? Do you have some understanding of that in certain regions, that sort of thing?
Yeah, it's a great question. In terms of our direct influence on that, it's actually very low. Through the education quality program, there is a parent engagement component to that, as how the school can serve as effectively a way to administer messages and education to their communities and parents. However, a large focus of that program is on getting out of school kids into school, and particularly trying to encourage a reduction in dropout rates. In a large number of the markets that we work with in sub-Saharan Africa, it's pretty common that only about 60% of kids that enter the program, enter school systems at the start of primary school, will make it through to the end of school. Then about 30% of schools, so we see about half of those kids drop out at the end of primary school. So only about 30% make it through the start of secondary school. And then it's not uncommon for about 10 to 15% to complete secondary school and make it through to tertiary level. And so dropout is by far the biggest issue that we see. It's an issue for boys, but it's a particular issue for girls, particularly around adolescence ages.
Well, thanks for that answer. Chris, again, he wants to know the average sized loan, I guess, to a school, and what's the average number of students in the average school?
Yeah, both good questions. So the average size of a loan to a school right now is about $8,500 US, which I think is around 10 or 11,000 Canadian dollars. And the average size of the school is about 300 students. So in Africa, the schools tend to be a lot larger than they are in, say, Asia and Latin America. And that's just due to populations growing a lot more quickly.
And with the, you've had some great success with USAID. And what I love about that is, as you say, it's helping to scale the program, and everywhere is going to benefit from that. So as you look, and of course they were country specific, but when you look beyond the current USAID funded programs, where else do you see the program expanding over the next number of years?
Great question. And so it can be driven by either two things. So firstly, starting from like where the demand is for our program, or where we think the program could be successful at scale. A few years ago, we did a pretty deep analysis of every country in the world to look for the biggest opportunities for us to have meaningful impact with this program model at scale. And we found that there's about 53 countries across Africa, Asia, and Latin America where we think that this program could be successful. Right now, we operate in 25 of those countries. And so there is plenty of room for this program and model to expand into new markets over time. The biggest constraint on that, there's effectively two. It's our capacity to deliver program expansion and funding to actually do it. If we had unlimited funding, then over time, we could certainly work to expand this program into more and more of these markets. Specifically, some of the biggest opportunities that we see across across Africa right now would be the expansion of both financing and education quality into Ethiopia, the expansion of our education quality program into more schools across some of our biggest core markets, and that would be Ghana, Uganda, Kenya. In addition to the launch of the education quality program in Nigeria, we've developed a pretty big financial institution footprint over the last few years. In Asia, we've done quite a lot of work in India on school financing. It's one of our largest markets. And in Pakistan in a much smaller way, but that could be a very successful market for us. In Latin America, I think I covered that a little bit earlier, but I think the biggest opportunities for us right now are to expand both financing and education quality into a number of markets, particularly right now into the Dominican Republic and Haiti, amongst others.
Excellent, thanks. Can you speak to the issue, I guess, of addressing, serving people at the bottom of the economic ladder? Opportunity International, of course, our whole history has been helping people establish sustainable livelihoods so that they can work their way out of poverty. And how do you see the education finance program kind of addressing that segment?
Yeah, it's a great question, Dan. And it's something that we've been working on as a program since its inception in 2008. In that the way this program actually started was a little bit by chance in Ghana, in that one of the financial institutions that Opportunity International at the time owned and operated had a business loan product that any business would apply for. And what they increasingly noticed is that more and more financial institutions were, or more and more schools were approaching financial institutions looking for access to funding to build and grow their schools over time. And so from that point, the decision was made to spend some time trying to figure out if there was an economic way to lend to these schools and to grow and expand that over the last little while, the last 12 years. And so through that, through kind of the expansion of this school lending model, we've effectively learned how to optimize the product to make it, one, financially sustainable for schools, and two, attractive for financial institutions to expand and effectively invest into. And so as part of that, we've done quite a lot of work looking at ways to optimize the amount of capital that's been invested into low-cost schooling, but into ways to push that capital down market. Now, to date, outside of the work or the technical assistance work that we've done with the financial institutions, we haven't had to offer subsidies to financial institutions to do this, in that we found that once we're able to educate the financial institutions on the size of the market and the loan product design, we're able to encourage them to invest their own balance sheet or own capital to invest into the school sector, which is ultimately the most efficient way for us to use donor money. Now, fast forward, there may be a way that we're able to push this capital further and further down market into lower and lower income communities, but we may need to look at subsidies to do that. We just haven't got there yet.
Super. There's one last question here. And of course, if you guys have any more questions, we probably have a few more minutes and take a couple more, so feel free. But does Opportunity partner with any nonprofits within the education space?
Yeah, great question. And so the answer is yes. And so roughly 1/3 of the 69 financial institution partners that we work with in country are not-for-profit, the other 2/3 being for-profit. Now, we personally don't mind, in that our goal is to get more kids into better schools. And whether that's better done with for-profit financial institution partners or not-for-profit, we don't really mind. What we are concerned about is their ability to disperse large amounts of loans into low-income schools, and to do that at the lowest cost possible for the schools so that they can continue to grow.
And I imagine the questioner was also probably thinking of it more on the program development side of things, because do you have any engagement with other not-for-profits that are active in this sector?
Yeah, and so on the education quality side, there's two key partners that we have that allow us to deliver a pretty well-rounded and efficient program. Both of those partners are social enterprises, so they're technically for-profit, but with social missions. The first one of those is called Chalkboard Education. They're a Ghanaian-based technology company that effectively provide us with the platform, with a tech platform that allows us to distribute our education quality program. So that's the training and support that we provide to school leaders and teachers in really low resource settings. And so what Chalkboard Education does is it takes high bandwidth content and condenses that, loads it onto its platform, and it allows school leaders and teachers with the tablets and access to that content to access it for free when they are offline. And so what that does is it increases the accessibility of that content, particularly for school leaders and teachers that are in really low resource settings, that may not have access to mobile data and things like that.
Cool. I think we have one last question here. Someone just wants to get a little better understanding on the loan portfolio, maybe particularly, I don't know whether it's direct loans through opportunity or leveraged loans, but they want to know how the split is between school loans and school fee loans to families.
Got it. And so the average portfolio split across the program right now is about 60% of capital is invested into schools, for the schools to fund new classroom construction of washrooms, dormitories, and purchase of assets like school buses. Slightly less than 40% is invested into school fee loans. So for parents to pay for school fees to stop kids from dropping out in and out of school, which is particularly important for keeping girls in school and stopping them from dropping out over time when families are faced with lumpy or seasonal household income and have to make those tough decisions. The third product that's a lot smaller and a lot more difficult to make economic is student lending for students at tertiary level. So whether that be either increasing access to university studies or other tertiary and vocational training.
Excellent, thank you. All right, well, I think at this point, we're almost 50 minutes into the seminar. And so I thank everybody for their attendance. Thank you for the engaging questions. Those have been awesome. And Andrew, just thank you so much again for making time. I know you're incredibly busy. Just look at the rapid expansion of the program, and there's a lot on your plate, but we appreciate you taking some time out to talk to some Canadians here and bring us up to speed on this amazing program. And Opportunity Canada is just delighted to be a part of this amazing and transformative initiative. So any last words, and we'll end the webinar. No, of course, just to say thank you everyone for making time to join like what I think is personally a very important topic. It's a shame that I can't be in Canada to meet and talk to you as we would have done or may have done otherwise, but totally grateful for the time, the questions, and the opportunity to speak with you all. Totally very happy to follow up with anyone who would like to dive into any of these conversations in any detail. And just thank you so much for all of the support and interest. Excellent. Well, thanks very much. And thanks everyone. And we'll bid you a good afternoon or good evening, whatever it is where you are. So take care.